Chapter 22. The pale young gentleman and I stood contemplating one another in Barnard's Inn, until we both burst out laughing. "The idea of its being you," he said. "The idea of its being you," said I. And then we contemplated one another afresh and laughed again. "Well," said the pale young gentleman, reaching out his hand good-humouredly, "it's all over now. I hope, and it will be magnanimous of you, if you will forgive me for having knocked you about so." I derived from this speech that Mr. Herbert Pocket, for Herbert was the young gentleman's name, still rather confounded his attention with his execution. But I made a modest reply, and we shook hands warmly. "You hadn't come into your good fortune then, had you?" said Herbert. "No," said I. "No," he acquiesced. "I heard it happened very lately. I was rather on the lookout for a good fortune then." "Indeed?" "Yes. Miss Havisham had sent for me to see if she would take a fancy to me, but she couldn't. Well, at all events, she didn't." I thought it polite to remark that I was surprised to hear that. "Oh, bad taste," said Herbert, laughing. "But a fact. Yes, she had sent for me on a trial visit, and if I'd come out of that successfully, I suppose I should have been provided for. Perhaps I should have been what you say to Estella." "What's that?" I asked with sudden gravity. He was arranging his fruit in plates while we talked, which divided his attention, and was the cause of his having made a lapse. "Affianced," he explained, still busy with the fruit. "Betrothed, engaged, engaged, any word of that sort." "How did you bear your disappointment?" I asked. "Oh," said he, "I didn't care much for it. She's a Tartar." "Miss Havisham?" I suggested. "I don't say no to that, but I meant Estella. That girl's hard and haughty and capricious to the last degree, and has been brought up by Miss Havisham to wreak revenge on all the male sex." "What relation is she to Miss Havisham?" "None," he said. "Only adopted." "Why should she wreak revenge on all the male sex? What revenge?" "Lord, Mr. Pip," said he, "don't you know?" "No," said I. "Dear me, it's quite a story, and shall be saved till dinner time. Now, let me take the liberty of asking you a question. How did you come there that day?" I told him, and he was attentive until I'd finished, and then burst out laughing again, and asked me if I was sore afterwards. I didn't ask him if he was sore, for my conviction on that point was perfectly established. "Mr. Jaggers is your guardian, I understand?" he went on. "Yes." "You know he is Miss Havisham's man of business and solicitor, and has her confidence when nobody else has." This was bringing me near, I felt, towards dangerous ground. I answered with a constraint I made no attempt to disguise, that I had seen Mr. Jaggers in Miss Havisham's house on the very day of our combat, but never at any other time, and that I believed he had no recollection of ever having seen me there. "He was so obliging as to ask my father to be your tutor. You know, it's an extraordinary thing. Of course, he knew about my father's connection with Miss Havisham. My father is Miss Havisham's cousin. Not that that implies familiar intercourse between them, for he is a bad courtier and will not propitiate her." Herbert Pocket had a frank and easy way with him that was very taking. I had never seen anyone since then, and I had never seen anyone before, who more strongly expressed to me in every look and tone a natural incapacity to do anything secret or mean. There was something wonderfully hopeful about his general air, and something that at the same time whispered to me that he would never be successful or rich. I don't know how this was, I became imbued with the notion on the first occasion before we sat down to dinner, but I cannot define by what means. He was still a pale young gentleman, and had a certain conquered languor about him in the midst of his spirits and briskness that did not indicate of natural strength. He had not a handsome face, but it was better than handsome, being extremely amiable and cheerful. His figure was a little ungainly, as in the days when my knuckles had taken such liberties with it, but it looked as if it might always be light and young. Whether Mr. Trabb's local work would have sat more gracefully upon him than upon me may be a question, but I am conscious that he carried off his rather old clothes much better than I carried off my new suit. As he was so communicative, I felt that reserve on my part would be a bad turn unsuited to our years. I therefore told him my small story, and laid stress on my being forbidden to inquire who my benefactor was. I further mentioned that I had been brought up a blacksmith in a country place, and knew very little of ways of politeness, and I would take it as a great kindness in him if he would give me a hint whensoever he saw me at a loss or going wrong. "With pleasure," said he, "though I venture to prophesy that you'll want very few hints. I dare say we shall often be together, and I shall like to banish any needs of restraint between us. Will you do me the honour to begin at once to call me by my Christian name, Herbert?" I thanked him and said I would. I informed him in exchange that my Christian name was Philip. "I don't take to Philip," said he, smiling, "for it sounds rather like a moral boy out of a spelling book who was so lazy that he fell into a pond, or so fat that he couldn't see out of his eyes, or so avaricious that he locked up his cake until the mice ate it, or so determined to go bird's nesting that he found himself eaten by bears who lived handy in the neighbourhood. I tell you what I should like. We are so harmonious, and you have been a blacksmith. Would you mind it?" "I shouldn't mind anything you propose," I answered, "but I don't understand you. Would you mind Handel for a familiar name? There's a charming piece of music by Handel called The Harmonious Blacksmith. I should like it very much." "Then, my dear Handel," said he, turning round as the door opened, "here is dinner, and I must beg of you to take the top table, because dinner is of your providing." I would not hear of sitting at the top, so he took the top and I faced him. It was a nice little dinner, seemed to me then a very Lord Mayor's feast, and it acquired additional relish from being eaten under those independent circumstances, with no old people by, and with London all around us. This again was heightened by a certain gipsy character that set the banquet off, for while the table was, as Mr. Pumblechook might have said, the lap of luxury, being entirely furnished forth from the coffee-house, the sitting-room being so cramped and full of furniture, it imposed upon the waiter the wandering habit of putting the covers on the floor where he fell over them, the melted butter in the armchair, the bread on the bookshelves, the cheese in the coal scuttle, and the boiled fowl into my bed in the next room, where I found it much in its parsley and butter, in a state of congelation, when I retired for the night. All this made the feast delightful, and when the waiter was not there to watch me, my pleasure was without alloy. We had made some progress in the dinner when I reminded Herbert of his promise to tell me about Miss Havisham. "True," he replied, "I'll redeem it at once. Let me introduce the topic. Now, Handel, I must mention that in London it is not the custom to put the knife in the mouth, for fear of accidents, you understand, and that while the fork is reserved for that use, it is not put further in than is necessary. It is scarcely worth mentioning, only it's well to do as other people do. Also, the spoon is not generally used overhand, but under. This has two advantages. You get it at your mouth better, which, after all, is the object of the exercise, and you save a good deal of the attitude of opening oysters on the part of the right elbow. He offered these friendly suggestions in such a lively way that we both laughed, and I scarcely blushed. Now, he pursued, concerning Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham, you must know, was a spoilt child. Her mother died when she was a baby, and her father denied her nothing. Her father was a county gentleman down in your part of the world and was a brewer. I don't know why it is, but it's a crack to be a brewer. But it's indisputable that you cannot possibly be genteel and bake. You may be as genteel as never was and brew. You see it every day. Yet a gentleman may not keep a public house, may he? Said I. Not on any account, returned Herbert. But a public house may keep a gentleman. Well, Mr. Havisham was very rich and very proud. So was his daughter. Miss Havisham was an only child, I hazarded. Stop a moment, I'm coming to that. No, she was not an only child. She had a half-brother. Her father privately married again. His cook, I rather think. I thought he was proud, said I. My good Handel, so he was. He married his second wife privately because he was proud, and in course of time she died. When she was dead, I apprehend he first told his daughter what he had done, and then the son became part of the family, residing in the house you're acquainted with. As the son grew to be a young man, he turned out riotous, extravagant, undutiful, altogether bad. At last, his father disinherited him, but he softened when he was dying and left him well off enough, although not as well off as Miss Havisham. Take another glass of wine, and excuse my mentioning that society as a body does not expect one to be so strictly conscientious in emptying one's glass as to turn its bottom upwards with the rim on one's nose. I had been doing this in an excess of attention to his recital. I thanked him and apologized, and he said, not at all, and resumed. Miss Havisham was now an heiress, and you may suppose was looked upon as a great match. Her half-brother had now ample means again, but what with debts and with the new madness wasted them most fearfully again. There were stronger differences between him and her than there had been between him and his father, and it's suspected that he cherished a deep and moral grudge against her as having influenced the father's anger. Now I come to the cruel part of the story. Merely breaking off, my dear Handel, to remark that a dinner napkin will not go into a tumbler. Why I was trying to pack mine into a tumbler, I am hardly unable to say. I only know that I found myself, with a perseverance worthy of a much better cause, making the most strenuous exertions to compress it within those limits. Again I thanked him and apologized, and again he said in the cheerfulest manner, not at all, I am sure, and resumed. There appeared upon the scene, say at the races or the public balls or anywhere else you like, a certain man who made love to Miss Havisham. I never saw him, for all this happened 25 years ago, before you and I were, Handel. But I have heard my father mention that he was a showy man, and the kind of man for the purpose, but that he was not to be, without ignorance or prejudice, mistaken for a gentleman. My father most strongly avers, because it is a principle of his that no man who is not a true gentleman at heart ever was, since the world began, a true gentleman in manner. He says no varnish can hide the grain of the wood, and that the more varnish you put on, the more grain will express itself. Well, this man pursued Miss Havisham closely and professed to be devoted to her. I believe she had not shown much susceptibility up to that time, but all she possessed certainly came out then, and she passionately loved him. There was no doubt that she was perfectly besotted with him. She idolized him. He practiced on her affection in that systematic way that he got great sums of money out of her, and he induced her to buy her father out of the share of the brewery, which had been weekly left to him by his father, at an immense price, on the plea that when he was her husband, he must have hold of everything and manage it all. Your guardian was not at that time at Miss Havisham's counsels, and she was too haughty and too much in love to be advised by anyone. Her relations were poor and scheming, with the exception of my father. He was poor enough, but not time-serving or jealous, the only independent one among them, and he warned her that she was doing too much for this man and placing herself too unreservedly under his power. She took the first opportunity of angrily ordering my father out of the house in the man's presence, and my father has never seen her since. I thought of her having said, "Matthew will come and see me at last when I am laid dead upon that table." And I asked Herbert whether his father had refused to forgive her. "Oh, it's not that," he said, "but she charged him, you see, in the presence of her intended husband, with being disappointed in the hope of fawning upon her for his own advancement. And if he were to go to her now, it would look true even to him and even to her. To return to the wretched man, let's make an end of him." The marriage day was fixed. The wedding dresses were bought. The wedding tour was planned out. The wedding guests arrived. The wedding came, but not the bridegroom. He wrote a letter, which she received, I struck in, when she was dressing for her marriage at 20 minutes to 9. "At the hour and minute," said Herbert, nodding, "at which afterwards she stopped all the clocks. What was in it further than that most heartedly broke the marriage off. It was all in the letter. I can't tell you what he said, because I don't know. When she recovered from a bad illness that she had, she laid the whole place waste as you have seen it, and she has never again looked upon the light of day." "Is that all the story?" I asked, after considering it. "All I know of it. And indeed, I only know so much as through piecing it together for myself, for my father always avoids it, and even when Miss Havisham invited me to go there, told me no more of it than it was absolutely requisite that I should understand. But I've forgotten one thing. It has been supposed that the man to whom she gave her misplaced confidence acted throughout in concert with her wretched half-brother, that it was a conspiracy between them, and that they shared the profits." "I wonder he didn't marry her and get all the property," said I. "He might have been married already, and her cruel mortification may have been part of her half-brother's scheme," said Herbert. "Mind, I don't know that." "What became of the two men?" I asked, after again considering the subject. "They fell into deeper shame and degradation, if there can be deeper, and ruin. Are they alive now?" "I don't know." "You said just now that Estella was not related to Miss Havisham, but adopted. When adopted?" Herbert shrugged his shoulders. There has always been an Estella since I heard of a Miss Havisham. I know no more. And now, Handel, said he, finally, throwing off the story, as it were, there is a perfectly open understanding between us. All that I know about Miss Havisham you know, and all that I know, I retorted, you know. I fully believe it, so that there can be no competition or perplexity between you and me. And as to the condition on which you hold your advancement in life, namely that you are not to inquire or discuss it with anyone as to whom you owe it, you may be very sure that it will never be encroached upon or even approached by me or by anyone else belonging to me. In truth, he said this with so much delicacy that I felt the subject was done with, even though I should be under his father's roof for years and years to come. Yet he said it with so much meaning, too, that I felt he perfectly understood Miss Havisham to be my benefactress, as I understood the fact myself. It had never occurred to me before that he had led up to that theme for the purpose of clearing it out of our way, but we were so much the lighter and easier for having broached it that I now perceived it was the case. We were very happy and sociable, and I asked him in the course of conversation what he was. He replied, I am a capitalist, an insurer of ships. I suppose he saw me glancing about the room in search of some tokens of shipping or capital, for he added in the city, I had grand ideas of the wealth and importance of insuring ships in the city, and I began to shrink with awe at ever having laid a young insurer on his back, blackened his enterprising eye, and cutting his reasonable head open. But again there came upon me for my relief this odd impression that Herbert Pocket would never be very successful or rich. I shall not rest satisfied with merely employing my capital in insuring ships, he said. I shall buy up some good life insurance shares and cut into that direction. I shall also do a little mining. None of those things will interfere with my chartering a few thousand tons on my account. I shall trade, I think, he said, leaning back in his chair, to the East Indies for silks, shawls, spices, dyes, drugs, and precious woods. It's an interesting trade, you know. Is it a profitable trade? Said I. Oh, tremendously, said he. I wavered again, and began to think here were greater expectations than my own. I think I shall trade also, said he, putting his thumbs in his waistcoat pocket, to the West Indies for sugar, tobacco, and rum, also to Ceylon, especially for elephants' tusks. You'll want a good many ships, said I. Yes, a perfect fleet, said he. Quite overpowered by the magnificence of these transactions, I asked him where the ships he insured mostly traded at present. Oh, well, I haven't been insuring very long, he replied. In fact, at the moment, I'm looking about me. Somehow that pursuit seemed more in keeping with Barnard's Inn, and I said in a note of conviction, Aha. Yes, I'm in a counting house at present and looking about me. In a counting house? Is that very profitable? I asked. Do you mean to the young fellow who's in it? He asked in reply. Yes, to you. Well, no, not to me. He said this with the air of one carefully reckoning and striking a balance. Not directly profitable. That is, it doesn't pay me anything, and I have to keep myself. This certainly had not a profitable appearance, and I shook my head as if I would imply that it would be difficult to lay by much accumulative capital from such a source of a venture. But the thing is, said Herbert Pocket, that to look about you is the grand thing. You're in a counting house, you know, and you look about you. It struck me as a singular implication that you couldn't be out of a counting house, you know, and look about you. But I silently deferred to his experience. Then the time comes, said Herbert, when you see your opening, and you go in, and you swoop on it, and you make your capital, and then there you are. Where you've once made your capital, you have nothing to do but employ it. This was very like his way of conducting that encounter in the garden, very like. His manner of bearing his poverty, too, exactly corresponded to the manner of bearing his defeat. It seemed to me that he took all blows and buffets now with just the same air as he had taken them then. It was evidence that he had nothing around him but the simplest necessities, for everything that I remarked upon turned out to have been sent there on my account from the coffee-house or elsewhere. Yet, having already made his fortune in his own mind, he was so unassuming with it that I felt quite grateful to him for not being puffed up. It was a pleasant addition to his naturally pleasant ways, and we got on famously. In the evening we went out for a walk in the streets, and went half-price to the theatre, and the next day we went to church at Westminster Abbey, and in the afternoon we walked in the parks, and I wondered who shod all the horses there, and wished that Joe did.